The morning air was crisp, the kind that made the wooden walls of the remote cabin creak ever so slightly as the sun struggled to rise over the dense pines of the Appalachian wilderness. Jake rolled over in bed, half awake, stretching his arms toward Emily, who was still sound asleep under the thick quilt. The quiet hum of the forest was as familiar as the scent of pine that lingered in the house. But today, something felt off. A faint scratching sound, hesitant but persistent, was coming from the front porch. At first, Jake thought it might be the wind nudging a loose board, but when he listened closely, there was something rhythmic about it, almost purposeful. His heart pounded as he sat up, rubbing his eyes before swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "Did you hear that?" he murmured, nudging Emily awake. She groaned but sat up slowly, tucking her dark hair behind her ears as she blinked the sleep from her eyes. The scratching continued, followed by a small whimper, a sound so fragile and desperate that it sent a chill through Jake's spine. He grabbed the shotgun from the rack by the door, not because he wanted to use it, but because living in the middle of nowhere meant being prepared for anything. Emily pulled on her robe and stepped behind him, placing a cautious hand on his back as he unlocked the door. The moment the wooden planks groaned beneath his step, the scratching stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, as Jake eased the door open just a crack, he sucked in a sharp breath. A tiny, shivering bear cub sat on the porch, its dark eyes wide with something that wasn't just fear. It was pleading. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, its soft brown fur matted with dirt, its tiny paws leaving smudges on the wooden boards. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her heart breaking at the sight. The cub whimpered again, stepping closer on wobbly legs. But then Jake noticed something strange. Around its neck was a small leather pouch, tied tightly with a frayed piece of twine. "What the hell?" he muttered, lowering the shotgun as he knelt carefully. The cub didn't flinch. In fact, it almost seemed to be waiting for them to do something, as if it knew exactly what it was doing there. "It has something," Emily breathed, stepping closer. The pouch looked old, worn from exposure, the edges curled and darkened with age. It wasn't something that would have naturally ended up on a wild animal, which meant someone had put it there. But who and why? The couple exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. Slowly, Jake reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough leather of the pouch. The cub let out a soft sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, almost as if it was urging him on. With careful hands, Jake untied the twine, his pulse quickening as he slid the pouch off the cub's neck. The tiny bear let out a small sigh and curled its paws beneath its body, as though relieved. Emily knelt beside Jake, her breath shallow as he pulled open the pouch and reached inside. His fingers brushed against something dry and delicate paper, a folded note. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled it out, the edges crumbling slightly from age or exposure. The handwriting was faded but still legible. As he unfolded it, his stomach tightened. "What does it say?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake swallowed hard and read aloud. "Please, if you find this, follow the cub. Time is running out. Help me. Situation." The words on the old paper were scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic handwriting, the ink smudged in places, as though written in desperation. "Follow the cub. Time is running out. Help me." It didn't say who had written it or when. It didn't give a name or any real details, only an eerie urgency that sent a chill creeping up his spine. He looked at Emily, whose face was pale, her eyes locked onto the paper as if willing it to give them more answers. "This doesn't make any sense," she whispered. Who could have left this? Jake's mind was already spinning through possibilities. They were miles from the nearest town, deep in the forest with no neighbors for at least 15 miles. The thought of a lost hiker crossed his mind, but the condition of the paper and the way it had been tucked into the pouch suggested it had been here for a while. More disturbingly, the person who wrote it had sent the cub as a messenger. That meant they were either incredibly resourceful or incredibly desperate. The bear cub, now slightly more at ease, sniffed at their boots before letting out a soft grunt. It turned its head toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing, ears perked, body tense. "I think it wants us to follow it," Jake said, swallowing hard. The note hadn't been vague about that part. "Follow the cub." Emily hesitated, her brows furrowed. "Jake, if someone really needs help, we should call the ranger station." Jake grimaced. "We don't have a signal out here, Em. We'd have to drive into town, and by the time we got someone out here, it could be too late." He looked back at the cub, which had taken a few tentative steps toward the trees, then paused to look back at them expectantly. "I think this thing came straight to us for a reason." Emily exhaled, rubbing her arms against the cold. She didn't like it. She didn't like the unknowns, the eerie sense that they were stepping into something far bigger than they understood. But she knew Jake was right. If someone out there needed help, they couldn't afford to waste time. Jake grabbed his flashlight and their emergency pack, slinging it over his shoulder before loading the revolver they kept for protection. Emily pulled on her boots and thick jacket, her nerves on edge as she cast one last glance at the house. A part of her wanted to stay behind, let Jake handle it, but another part of her knew that whatever this was, they had to face it together. The bear cub took the lead, trotting through the underbrush with surprising purpose. It was small, but it moved with determination, as if it knew exactly where it was going. They followed, the forest closing in around them, branches heavy with frost. The morning sun barely cut through the thick canopy, casting long shadows that danced eerily in their path. Every crunch of their boots on fallen leaves made Emily's heartbeat quicken. They walked in silence for nearly an hour, the cub always just ahead, never pausing for long. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the forest became. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, the air heavy with something Jake couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling of being watched. Then they saw it, a clearing unnaturally circular. The grass flattened as if something or someone had been there. In the center, partially buried beneath a pile of old leaves and debris, was a backpack. Jake approached cautiously, nudging the pack with the toe of his boot before crouching down to inspect it. The fabric was faded and torn in places, the zipper rusted from exposure. His stomach tightened as he reached for the tag sewn into the back. D. Miller. Emily gasped. "Wait, isn't that?" Jake's jaw clenched. David Miller, a hiker who had disappeared 3 years ago. His case had been all over the news back then. How he had set out alone for a week-long trek into the Appalachian wilderness and never returned. Search teams had combed the mountains for months, but no trace of him had ever been found. Until now. "This doesn't make sense," Jake muttered, unzipping the bag. Inside were the remnants of supplies, a shattered flashlight, a moldy granola bar, a rusted pocket knife, and another note. This one was more deteriorated than the last, the ink barely readable. "They won't let me leave. If you find this, I am still here. Please." The rest was smudged unreadable. Emily shuddered. "Jake, what the hell is going on?" The cub let out a low whimper, pawing at the ground beside them. Jake followed its gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. There, beneath the leaves and soil, was a bone. Not just any bone, a human femur. Emily recoiled, covering her mouth, her entire body trembling. "Oh my God!" Jake stood abruptly, his mind racing. If David Miller was here, if this was his backpack, then what had happened to him? The note suggested he had been trapped somehow, but by what? Or by who? A rustling in the trees made them both freeze. Emily gripped Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his jacket. "Did you hear that?" Jake tightened his grip on the revolver. "Yeah." The cub's ears perked again, its body low to the ground, as if sensing something neither of them could see. The silence that followed was even worse than the sound itself. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Then the cub did something unexpected. It turned sharply, not toward the sound, but toward another path leading deeper into the forest. It let out a sharp grunt, almost insistent, before taking off at a quicker pace. It was urging them forward. Jake exhaled. They had a choice. Turn back and pretend they never saw this, or keep going. He looked at Emily, who was already shaking her head. Jake, no. This is insane. We don't know what we're dealing with, but deep down, she knew what he was about to say before he even said it. If someone's still alive, Jake whispered, we can't just leave them. Emily clenched her jaw, fear and determination warring in her chest. But then, without another word, she grabbed his hand and nodded. Together, they followed the cub into the unknown. Jake and Emily pressed on, their breath forming thin clouds in the cold, dense air. The bear cub trotted ahead of them, its small frame disappearing into the mist that curled between the trees. Each step forward seemed heavier, as if the very force itself were resisting them. The eerie silence lingered, no birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of wind, just their footsteps, crunching against the brittle leaves and frost-covered grass and the quiet, almost rhythmic breathing of the cub. Emily kept a firm grip on Jake's arm, her nails digging slightly into his sleeve. This doesn't feel right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake swallowed, nodding. I know. But neither of them stopped. The message they had found in the pouch, the desperate plea for help, had burrowed deep into their minds, refusing to let go. If someone had been out here for years, waiting to be rescued, then turning back wasn't an option. The deeper they walked, the more unnatural the surroundings became. The thick Appalachian forest had always carried an ancient, almost otherworldly energy, but this was different. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches curling at odd angles, as if reaching out toward them. The very air was heavy, thick with something metallic, a faint scent that burned the back of Jake's throat. He glanced at Emily, and from the way she wrinkled her nose, she smelled it too. Then the trees opened up. The thick underbrush gave way to a clearing, but unlike the natural ones they'd come across before, this one was unervingly symmetrical. The trees had been cut back deliberately, forming a near-perfect circle. The ground was completely bare, the grass dead and brittle, as if something had drained the life from it. And at the center of the clearing, it stood. Jake's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a house, nor a ruined cabin left to rot. It was a bunker, a metal hatch, half buried in the earth, rusted and covered in patches of moss and tangled vines. Time had not been kind to it. The metal had corroded in places, deep scratches and dents lining the surface, as if someone or something had tried to claw their way in. Emily's fingers tightened around Jake's arm. Jake, this is wrong. The cub let out a soft grunt, its dark eyes fixed on the bunker, but it did not step closer. It remained at the treeline, its small body trembling. Jake forced himself to step forward. His fingers brushed against the deep grooves in the door, scratch marks. They weren't from an animal. The edges were jagged, as if they had been made by human hands. Then he saw them, footprints, fresh ones, leading inside. Jake's heartbeat quickened. Someone had been here. Recently. He glanced back at Emily, whose face had gone pale, then turned to the cub, who whimpered softly but didn't move. Whatever had brought them here, the little bear wanted no part of what lay beyond that hatch. With a deep breath, Jake grabbed the handle and pulled. The door gave a horrific screech as rusted metal ground against metal. A rush of stale, ice-cold air poured out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Emily gagged, stumbling back. Jesus? Jake lifted his flashlight, shining it into the dark void below. The bunker's entrance led to a narrow stairwell. The concrete walls cracked and damp with condensation. The light flickered as it touched the floor below, revealing something that sent a chill through his bones. There were words carved into the walls, hundreds of them, some written in ink, others etched into the concrete, desperate, frantic messages covering every inch. They watch. They listen. They never leave. Don't sleep. Don't look. They took them. They took them all. Emily clutched Jake's arm, her breathing uneven. Who wrote this? Jake swallowed hard. Whoever was trapped in here. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots echoing against the cold metal steps. Emily hesitated but followed. The cub remained at the entrance, staring down with wide, fearful eyes but refusing to move. The air inside the bunker was suffocating, thick, damp, and wrong. The deeper they descended, the colder it became. The floor was coated in dust and scattered debris, old food cans, a rusted lantern, and Jake stopped cold. Against the far wall was a wooden desk, a journal sitting on top, its pages yellowed with age. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the brittle paper. The handwriting inside was uneven. The ink smudged in places, rushed, panicked. Day 14. The noises won't stop. I hear them at night. I try to ignore them, but they're getting closer. Day 32. Food is running low. I can't leave. The last time I tried, it was waiting for me outside. Watching. Waiting. Day 89. I saw it today. The eyes. It doesn't move, but it's always there. I know it's real now. I know it's not just in my head. Jake's heart pounded. He turned to the front page. There, scrawled in smudged ink, was a name. David Miller. Emily gasped. Jake, this is his. A sudden crash sounded from behind them. Jake whirled, his flashlight beam darting across the room. Something had moved. Emily grabbed his wrist. Jake, we need to go. Then the bear cub whimpered. Jake turned back to the entrance just in time to see the cub backing away, its fur bristling, ears flattened against its skull. Then, from just outside the bunker, came footsteps. Not running, walking, heavy, deliberate. Then they stopped. Silence. Emily's grip on Jake's arm tightened. He felt her nails biting into his skin. She didn't have to say anything. They both knew something was out there. Then, a slow, deliberate breath. Not theirs. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. He turned off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. Then, in the heavy silence, came a sound that turned his blood to ice. A voice. Low. Hollow. Not human. You should not have come. Then, the light bulb above them shattered. Darkness swallowed them whole.